All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the End Times. Glad you could make it this evening. No, for real though, thank y'all so much for coming out tonight, and thank you so much for giving us a couple hours of your evening. I know that all of you have things going on, and so we're really excited that you're here. And honestly, this is our biggest workshop so far, most well attended. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here tonight. My name is Josh Gatewood, one of the teaching ministers here at Stonegate. And as many of you are aware, this is going to be our first workshop of about 4 workshops that we have coming up for you in the spring. And tonight, we're going to really kind of dig into really a topic that's been on everybody's mind for quite some time, which is the subject of the last times. There's lots of information out there on this question of the end times, and maybe you've come in this evening with your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own convictions, and I'll be honest with you, that's a great thing. But tonight, I think what we're going to do is hopefully, one of my goals tonight is to address maybe some of the myths, some of the conspiracy theories, and maybe just some of the misinformation that's out there surrounding the end times and some of the contemporary ideas associated with it. And so, with that being said, I'm going to kind of ease us into the evening, and then about, 20 minutes from now, we're going to put it in 5th gear, go full throttle, and have a lot of fun. But tonight, we're just going to start out kind of like those old diesel pickups used to. You know, you just kind of start it up and let it kind of sit for about, 30 minutes or so, and then we'll jump on the gas and get going, because when we get going, we're going to get going. But before we get there, let me just ask you all a question real quick. What comes to your mind, or what feelings come into your heart when you see this symbol? Yeah. What about this picture from last year? You see, all of us during the year 2020 experienced a number of different things, but 2 of them, COVID-19 and the riots that we saw on our streets, all began to make us think, if we weren't already thinking about it, that maybe this is the end. Maybe these are some of the wars and rumors of wars. Maybe this is the famines and the earthquakes that Jesus talked about. And 2020 for all of us really brought this issue of, are we living in the last days, to a new fever pitch. And as a result of that, information began to proliferate on the internet and on the news media. Many of us began to wonder, is it possible that we're living in the final days? Now, one of the cool things that came out of 2020 was all the internet memes that people were making, right? You're spending so much time on the internet, you might as well make a couple of funny memes out of it. One of my favorite ones that relates to our topic tonight was this one. That one came out about midway through, and I thought, yep, that's pretty appropriate. This lady was right on track. Or if you're a fan of Ron Burgundy, boy, the end times are escalating quickly. I don't know about y'all, but I was thinking that about midway through. Now, some of you may be excited about this. Some of you may be actually like, yes, could Jesus come back already? I'd be really happy with that. You'd be like this squirrel right here. The end times are upon us, and you'd be pretty excited to see that. Wherever you find yourself, this last year really just kind of took us through this process of like, where are we right now in the cultural moment? What does the Bible have to say about these things? And around the end of the year, we're thinking, okay, if 2020 ruins the holidays, we're going to be in big problems. Well, Thanksgiving comes along, Christmas comes along, and honestly, it, for the most part, went pretty well, aside from that whole election thing. And then we get through the end of the year, and we're like, okay, 2021 is a brand new year. Things are going to be good. They're going to get back to normal. And then this dude just shows up out of nowhere. And we're like, goodness gracious, this is just another sign of the end times, to which you saw more and more people saying something like this: repent, Jesus is coming soon. Is that true? Is it true that Jesus is coming soon? Are we living in the last days? Well, for many of you, you've already begun to think back to your childhood or at some point in your development in which you attended a workshop like this, or a seminar, or a Sunday school class, and just the mere thought of studying the end times makes you wish you had COVID-19, because it is just that much horrible memories for you. Maybe you actually had charts and graphs like this one whenever you were growing up, in which people were trying to track all the different elements of the end time calendar. And you just find yourself completely overwhelmed when you think about this question. As a matter of fact, I actually, for a long time, avoided this very question because of the perception that it was too confusing to get clarity on. Because of the misperception that the Bible doesn't have any sort of clear points of truth that we can anchor to around it. Hopefully, if you land there tonight coming in where you think this is a topic that is too confusing to get clarity on, hopefully tonight you'll walk away with some clarity and some biblical understanding and not just something that some guy wrote up with a chart. But for many around this table tonight, for many in our society today, the fact of the matter is this subject of the end times is one that creates confusion, it creates frustration, and that's why one final meme, many people would say one does not simply understand an evangelical's end times theology because there's just so much to it. Well, tonight we're going to hopefully cut right down the middle by looking at what Jesus says about the end times, and maybe he's going to give us some authoritative interpretation that'll guide us and shape us and give us some perspective to move forward with. And so the question for tonight is a simple question. It requires a lot of unpacking, but it's very simply this. Are we living in the last days? Are we living in the last days? Before you hear what I'm going to tell you this evening, I'd love for y'all to just turn to your tables and go ahead and share with each other what you think about this question. Are we living in the last days? What do you think? What makes you think that? And what are you hoping to get out of this evening? Spend about 5 minutes or so talking amongst yourselves, and then we will jump in and get going. I'll go ahead and pump the brakes a little bit. Okay. All right. Well, now that you maybe have an idea of where everybody at your table is, let me just say a few things before we get going. We're going to still kind of ease into some things, but hopefully all of you have one of these. This is your workbook for this evening. Pretty much everything that is going to be on the slideshow tonight is going to be in your workbook, and then a lot more. I've tried to actually give you a lot more notes than what you may even want, but hopefully that'll give you some more context for some of the issues and the different viewpoints that are on this issue. And then on the very, very back, you'll notice we've put together a recommended resources list that is pretty, I don't know if it's exhaustive or exhausting, to be honest with you, but it's a lot. And so just know there's a lot there. We're going to unpack some of those terms. So if you're looking at that going dispensational pre-what, don't worry, we're going to explain what some of that means here in a little bit. But if you go ahead and open up your workbook and turn over to page 2, and we're going to, again, still being kind of in the warm-up phase here, we're going to go ahead and fill in some blanks, and we're going to work through, and you'll kind of get a feel for how tonight is going to go. So before we get started, I need to give you an important disclaimer, all right? The first thing that I need to tell you is this. What you're going to hear tonight is not Stonegate's official position. It's not Stonegate's official position. No, instead, this is my official position, and the elders have given me permission to share my perspective. And so, whose position are you going to hear tonight? Stonegate's or Josh's? Very good. If you get on the internet and start saying, Stonegate believes something, we're going to kick you out of the church, okay? Council of Elders is right here in the middle. It's so ironic how they would sit right in the middle, right? And so they are here, they're watching, I'm telling you. They already know what's going on. Anyway, but even among our elders, you need to know that there are different views. And that's because on this issue, this is not going to be one of those issues that we're going to die on the hill. This is not going to be an issue like the resurrection of Christ or the Trinity or the authority of the Bible. This is one of those issues kind of like speaking in tongues or predestination. It's a secondary issue. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important, but it's not a primary orthodoxy or faith-defining issue. It's not going to be one of those things that we die on a hill. On that note, you will see a number of resources, like I already mentioned, but that are on the back of your workbook that honestly are going to be reflective of and give you more detail for both my position and the positions that many of you are probably familiar with, but also that our elders hold to. The reason why I'm teaching you tonight is because I actually taught a version of this over the course of 3 weeks to our men's Bible study back in August. And our men's Bible study just found it incredibly helpful and encouraging, because what you're going to hear tonight is that I actually have an optimistic view about the future. And I have even a hopeful view about the state of the world that we're living in spite of the crazy and the chaos that we see on the news all the time. And to be quite honest with you, one of the main reasons we wanted to offer this workshop to you is because we know with our cultural climate right now and with this question of the end times, there is so much fear, there is so much anxiety, and there is so much misinformation out there that fuels both of those things. And so tonight is really a chance for you to hear maybe a more optimistic perspective than what you grew up being told or what you already naturally believe. Don't believe it just because I said it, and don't believe it just because you want to be hopeful, but believe it if in fact you believe the scriptures lead you to that conclusion. One of the goals for tonight is to challenge a popular view that you've already heard, but to give you a biblical basis and to give you more scriptural information, so at the end of this you can go, you know what, I'm not sure if I agree with Josh on this, but at least I have another perspective and the biblical passages to look up and study. And honestly, our biggest hope out of tonight is that you'll leave here being able to compare different views biblically and not just having only one view that you've ever been taught your entire life. And so, in many ways, tonight is about equipping you to think biblically about this issue, encouraging you wherever you find yourself to be, but also giving you the tools to engage culturally so that wherever you find yourself, maybe you can have a more biblical basis for these things. With that being said, here's our roadmap for tonight. Our roadmap is simply going to be to understand how to interpret the Bible. We're going to spend about 5 minutes on some basics surrounding Bible interpretation, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about the last days according to Jesus. And along the way, we're going to hit some very fun, non-controversial points like the beast of Revelation, the Great Tribulation, the rapture, and the second coming of Christ. So, that sound good to everybody? Yeah. All right, we're still in the warm-up phase. We haven't gone fast yet. Let's do some Bible 101. So you'll see there, subsection B in your notes, Interpreting the Bible 101. This is vital vital for everything else we're going to say tonight. Here's the first point. The Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. The Bible was written for us. It is living and active. It is God's inspired word for every generation of disciples and Christ followers. But the Bible, the 66 books of the Old and the New Testaments, we are not the original audience of any of those books. There is an original historical audience, which means that the key question whenever you are interpreting the Bible is, how did the original audience understand this passage? How did the original audience? That is the controlling question whenever you seek to try to understand and apply any verse to the modern day. In other words, you can't do newspaper interpretation where you take current events and then read them into the scriptures. Instead, you take the scriptures and you read them into and try to inform and get a lens for the present day situation. One of my biggest pieces of advice for people along these lines is this: you must never read a Bible verse. Never read a Bible verse. Now you're thinking, why would Josh say that? Because you should always read the Bible's context. Every verse has a context. And if you take a verse out of context, then you'll misunderstand what that one verse is communicating to begin with. Here's a critical distinction along these lines. Critical distinction is between the original meaning and the modern application. The original meaning and the modern application. Okay? The original meaning of a verse is the meaning. The meaning. There is one original meaning to Bible verses and passages. But there are many applications. Here's what that means. It means we don't get our own personal meaning. We don't get our own personal Bible interpretation. We have to read the Bible in context. And then lastly, we can still apply it in a very personal way. So one of the things that I tell people is this: the Bible has one meaning, but it has an infinite amount of applications. One meaning is the original meaning, how the original audience would have understood it, but it could be applied in a multitude of different ways. Now, you step outside the world of church for a moment, and we understand this, right? Where are my husbands in the room? Anybody a husband in the room? If your wife sends you a text message and says, "Take out the garbage before I get home, please," and she gets home and the garbage has not been taken out, she says, "Hey, did you not get my text?" To which you then say, "Yeah, I got your text, but I thought take out the garbage, please means throw away some of your favorite clothes." Is there going to be a problem in the house? To which she says, "No, why would you think I meant that? That's not what I meant. Why would you think I meant that?" To which you then say, "Oh, well, that's what it meant to me. That's what I even prayed about it, and the Holy Spirit told me personally that you weren't talking about the actual trash in the trash can, but about that ugly whatever in the closet that is always staring at us." It's not going to go well, right? Not going to go well. We understand this to be true in human communication across all forms, and the same is true with the Bible. We don't get our own personal meaning. There is one original meaning, and you have to understand what those verses are in context to get that original meaning. Now, when we begin to come into the world of what's called eschatology, or the study of the end times, there are some basic terms to understand that will help us just a little bit, okay? So you flip the page over to page 3. One of the basic terms that helps us understand just a little bit of the lay of the landscape is what's called the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation, which is a period of intense distress, persecution, and calamity on earth. Many of you are like, 2020 is the Great Tribulation. It sounds very, very fitting. But then there's the other big term, which is called the millennium. The millennium, which is the period in which Jesus is actively reigning on the earth before he establishes the new heaven and the new earth. Now, here's what you need to know. Every position about the end times typically defines themselves in relation to one of these two positions. So, for example, you have what's called the pre-tribulation view or the post-tribulation view. You'll have the post-millennial view or the pre-millennial view, and then there's some other nuances in there. We're not going to get into the weeds of those tonight. Look at your recommended resources on the back for more information there. But the point is that when we think about this whole issue of the end times, these are two of the really important just kind of concepts and terms to help us get the lay of the land. When it comes to the millennium, depending on where you land, this could be a literal 1,000 years and a literal earthly reign. So for many of you, you're waiting for Jesus to come back to establish a 1,000-year reign on earth before he brings heaven to earth in the new heaven and the new earth. You're actually waiting for a literal physical kingdom with Jesus being the king of that kingdom to come before new heaven and new earth arrive. But for some people, it's actually a little bit different. For them, it is a figurative 1,000 years and a spiritual reign. And so from this perspective, the 1,000 years means the same thing as like in the Psalms whenever it says God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's not using 1,000 literally, it's using 1,000 to describe a big number or a long period of time. And in this regard, you're not so much waiting for a real Jesus to come back and do a real kingdom on earth right now. Instead, you believe that Jesus is reigning spiritually through his church, and then one day he'll bring the new heaven and new earth, and that'll be when the physical reign of Christ begins. How many of you are confused yet? Anybody? Okay, just one. That's good. Here's the deal. I say this just because this gives you a little bit of the lay of the land. This is not where we're going tonight. We're going somewhere else. But I wanted to tell you that when we talk about different views and different positions, this is just a helpful grid to let you know this is how people align themselves or line themselves up relative to the end times. Okay. Warm up is over. Are you warmed up? Do you need to go old school PE and stand up and stretch a little bit real quick, or are we good? Because you guys know me. You've heard me preach. I usually talk at about 85 with gusts of 150, and I don't slow down, and I go long still, and I'm trying to get you out of here by 8:30, and so I'm about to crank it up and go fifth gear full throttle. Are you guys ready for that? All right. Well, in the words of Heath Ledger, here we go. So what we're going to look at tonight is what's called the last days according to Jesus, which is based in a passage of Scripture called the Olivet Discourse. And so you guys should be over on page number 4 right now. The Olivet Discourse gets its name because it is a series of teachings that Jesus gave to his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And you find this teaching in 3 different places in the Gospels. It's really all the same account with a couple of little details that are different. You'll find it in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and in Luke 21. Really, it would be great if you looked up each one of these after tonight. But tonight what we're going to do is we're going to read Matthew 24 together. Matthew 24 is Jesus' prophecy about the end times. Here's what that means. It means that Jesus is looking back and standing inside of the Jewish tradition of the end times, which means Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, as the Messiah of God, he's giving us the authoritative perspective on all of the prophecy in Daniel or in the Psalms or in everything else that came before him, but he's also laying down the authoritative standard for the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John when he writes Revelation, that these guys are going to refer back to what Jesus is saying, either in the text or in the early church tradition. So we're going here because, 1, it's always a good idea to see what Jesus says about something, but 2, because he is Jesus giving us his prophecy and perspective on the end times, he is giving us what I think is the clearest, most helpful, but also the best starting point to understand everything that came before and also everything that was said after. And so if you have your Bibles, Matthew 24, if you don't, it's going to be here on the screen. Let's start reading. So as Jesus left and was going out of the temple, his disciples came up and called his attention to its buildings. He replied to them, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down." While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, hence Olivet Discourse, the disciples approached him privately and said, "Well, tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus begins to answer, verse 4. "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these events are the beginning of labor pains. Verse 9. Then they will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. And then many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. This good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation, sounds scary, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house, and a man in the field must not go back to his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for at that time there will be great distress, the kind that has not taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will be again. Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short because of the elect or those who are saved. I've actually spoken with people who did not want to have children because of those verses right there. Woe to pregnant or nursing women. Crazy stuff. Verse 23. If anyone tells you then, so here is the Messiah, or over there, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. So take note. I have told you in advance. So if they tell you, see, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. Or see, he's in the storerooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Let's stop right there and start filling in some blanks, shall we? So let's talk about the immediate context of this verse, okay? The immediate context is really important because Matthew 24 comes right after Matthew 23. And in Matthew 23, you really need to read it because it's not the meek and mild Jesus, it's the angry and hacked off Jesus. And he is pronouncing judgment on Israel's leaders. He has gone into the temple, he is so angry with them, and he is pronouncing God's judgment on them for being self-righteous, self-absorbed, horrible leaders. And then in verses 33 through 36, Jesus describes a judgment, and he uses the phrase, this generation. So he uses it in Matthew 23 and in Matthew 24, what we just read. Jesus says that this judgment on Israel's leaders is going to come upon this generation. And then he tells them in verse 38, your house is left to you desolate. That is a reference to the temple. And so really in verses 33 and onward, Jesus begins talking about the destruction of the temple in context of a judgment that God is going to bring upon the nation of Israel for its self-righteousness and its failure to actually love God and love people with the truths of God's word. And then when you get to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 24, Jesus fully predicts the temple's destruction. And so, what's going on here? Well, there's some more historical context we need to see. The first is that this was Israel's second temple. This was Israel's second temple. The first was Solomon's temple, so King David, his son Solomon. That temple was destroyed in 587 BC by the Babylonians. So think King Nebuchadnezzar, Book of Daniel, that's when all that was written. This temple was the Herodian temple. It was built by King Herod around 19 BC, and this temple was way more elaborate than Solomon's temple. It was way larger and way more decadent and had lots more to it than the first one did. First century Jews, very important, believed the Messiah would come to reign on the throne of this temple and then overthrow the Roman Empire. Their thought was very simply this, that God's Savior, God's Redeemer, the Messiah, is going to come and he's going to set up shop in this temple. He's going to sit on David's throne and he is going to overthrow the Roman Empire. In other words, you could say it like this. The temple was Israel's symbol of God's presence on earth. The temple was Israel's symbol of God's presence on earth. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for ancient Jewish people to describe the temple as the place where God and humans met, or where heaven and earth came together. I've given you a verse reference there in 2 Chronicles 7. I won't read the whole thing, but you'll see in this passage that several times that whenever the temple is described, it's described as the place where the glory of the Lord fills the temple, or the glory of the Lord fills the house. And so when Jesus begins talking about the destruction of the temple, when he begins to talk about judgment on the temple, whenever he begins to talk about not God's glory and not God's presence, but God's wrath coming on this temple, what Jesus is saying to these first century Jews is he is predicting a worst case scenario for them. He is predicting a worst case scenario because for them, the temple was central to their spiritual and political hope. It was central to their spiritual and political hope. In other words, everything they believed about God's activity for them, about God's promises for them, and about God's activity in the future centered around this. It was everything for them. So, what have we learned already, and where are we going with this? I give you that context to tell you this, that Jesus, in these first few verses of Matthew 24, is predicting a cataclysmic event. A cataclysmic event. What the World Trade Center was for the United States is very significant, but not as significant as the temple being destroyed for first century Jews. For first century Jews, it was even more significant for them. Secondly, Jesus is predicting the destruction of the most important symbol in Israel's spiritual and political life. And then these next 2 points are what's really fun for me. In Matthew 24 and following, Jesus is predicting something that'll take place in the first century. In the first century. In other words, everything we just read in Matthew 24 is what I believe something that already happened. Already happened. Most, possibly all, of what Jesus predicts in Matthew 24 I think has already happened. Some of you are not convinced. So let's have some fun. Turn the page. Remember, the disciples come to Jesus in verse 3 and they ask him 2 questions. What are those questions? The questions are, when will, quote, these things happen? And then 2, what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Well, it's important to see a couple of things. First of all, that for Jewish people in the first century, end of the age did not mean end of the world. It did not mean end of the space-time universe. No, for them, end of the age meant end of the present Jewish age. All throughout the Old Testament, Jewish people had this hope that they would have a Redeemer, a Messiah, and as a result, he was going to usher in a new age or a new era. And so when Jesus is talking about the end of some things, and the disciples come to him and say, okay, when will these things happen? When is the end of these things going to take place? They're not talking about the end of the physical universe like we moderns think about this. No, they're talking about the end of the age they were currently living in. And what they were currently living in was the age in which the temple was erected, there was the Old Testament law, there was the 10 Commandments, so on and so forth. But for the first century Jewish thought, there are only 2 ages. There was this age they were living in, and then there was the age to come. That's what they were operating with. In other words, for them, there was the Old Testament or the Old Covenant age, the age they were in, and then there was the age of the Messiah, which was the age to come. They did not think in other categories besides those two. And then finally, New Testament Christians, after the resurrection of Jesus, actually began to believe that they were living in the overlap of these two ages, that they were living in somehow this overlapping circle between the Old Covenant age and the Messianic or the New Covenant age. And we see this in a couple of places. You'll see the verses there in your notes. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul says this. He writes this, by the way, around 55 AD. Now, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and don't grumble as some of them did, and were killed by the destroyer. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our instruction, key phrase, on whom the end of the ages have come. The author of Hebrews makes the same point about the death of Jesus. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, which is only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. He did not do this to offer himself many times, as the high priest enters the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time, when? At the end of the ages, for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself. And so when you turn the page, it's important to have that context, because when Jesus begins to answer them, what I think Jesus does in verses 4 through 14 is he gives them a series of signs, and he calls them the beginning of labor pains. And these signs are the answer to the very first question the disciples ask him. Remember, that question is surrounding, when will these things take place? And so, sign number one that Jesus tells them are the beginning of labor pains are this: false teachers. False teachers. We'll go back to chapter 24. Jesus replied to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many." It's the first sign Jesus says at the beginning of labor pains, the indication that these things are about to happen. Now, it's interesting because I want you to think for a moment, if you've read your New Testament, how many times did the New Testament writers warn the early church about false teachers and false prophets? Yeah, as a matter of fact, New Testament Christians saw this fulfilled in their lifetime, because over and over again, and you see the references there in your notes, false prophets and false teachers were some of the biggest threats to the purity and integrity and faithfulness of the early church. As a matter of fact, the Jewish historian Josephus, he reports that during the reign of Nero, which is around 54 to 68 AD, false messiahs, false savior figures were arrested in Rome on almost a daily basis. This was a proliferating problem in the first century. But we cannot move on to the second thing that Jesus tells his disciples to look out for, because I know some of you are already thinking, well, what about the Antichrist and the beast of Revelation? Isn't the Antichrist the ultimate false prophet? Isn't he the ultimate false teacher? Isn't the beast or the mark of the beast the ultimate mark of deception? These are great questions. Well, interestingly enough, did you know that if you do a little Google search, Google's a great Bible study tool, by the way, and you look up the word or the phrase Antichrist, you're not going to find it one time in the book of Revelation. Not once. No, there are in fact about 4 references to Antichrist in the New Testament, but all of them are in 1st or 2nd John. They're in 1st or 2nd John. Now, that's not too off base, because John wrote Revelation and 1st and 2nd John, and so that's no problem. But here's the interesting thing. Each one of these references refer to false teachers or false teaching. For example, one of the teachings that was going around was that Jesus was not fully human, that he was only divine. And what's really interesting is that when you read the context of these verses, all of them assume that the Antichrist is presently active in the world they live in. As a matter of fact, sometimes John doesn't even call the Antichrist a person. He calls it the spirit of Antichrist, as though there's this spirit of opposition, this spirit of rejection, this spirit of doctrinal rejection to the core truths of the Christian faith. In other words, for John, whenever he's writing this, he will sometimes use Antichrist as a spirit or as a belief system, and sometimes he'll describe it as a person. But interestingly enough, whenever you think about the Antichrist and the beast, believe it or not, there's been a lot of possible interpretations of who the Antichrist is throughout history. In fact, the most common and the most popular interpretation for who the Antichrist is throughout history is, well, anybody want to take a guess real quick? Any American president. Some of you are like, yeah, the last one. Some of you are like, yeah, this one. Wherever you land, the president always seems to get a lot of crap for being the Antichrist. Second place, sometimes the beast has been explicitly called the Roman Catholic Church and or the Pope. As a matter of fact, one of the very first study Bibles that ever came out was the Geneva Study Bible over in Europe, in Geneva, Switzerland. And whenever you read Revelation 13 and 17, and it talks about the beast and the false prophet, there's a study note, and you go to the study note, and it says, that is the Pope. That's all they say. No other explanation. You're like, oh, guess you guys didn't like the Catholic Church very much, which it was in the Protestant Reformation, so they wouldn't have. Another interpretation throughout history has been Napoleon Bonaparte. And another, we can see this one, Adolf Hitler. All of these has been plausible candidates that people have come up with, that Christians have come up with for Antichrist or the beast throughout history. Well, what about the mark of the beast? Oh, this one's getting a lot of attention right now with the COVID vaccine. And so what have been some of the options that Christians have proposed throughout history to be the mark of the beast? Well, the $1 bill actually is one of the most famous ones. Another one is the barcode, believe it or not. The barcode. Another one is the internet. Some of you remember this. Like when all the stuff was coming out and you heard that sound, you're like, you're like, that's Satan winding up to get your soul. I don't know if anybody said that, but it felt fun to say. I'm on medicine. Okay. The iPhone was another one. I remember getting a first-generation iPhone, which, by the way, my 16-year-old nephew, whenever I said that, he was like, you're so old, Uncle Josh. I'm like, no, you're just young and stupid. Okay. And then finally, it seems like anything involving technology tends to get a bad rap for being the mark of the beast. Hashtag Bill Gates, hashtag microchip, hashtag conspiracy. So, why do I say all this? I say all this because remember what we said at the beginning. The Bible was written for us. It was not written to us. And the key question when interpreting a Revelation passage that's so apocalyptic and has so much prophecy in it is, how did the original audience understand this passage? That is to say, there was an original audience for the book of Revelation. There was an original audience that was receiving this information about an antichrist or a beast or a false prophet or whatever. And that means that the book of Revelation had a first century audience for us to glean the meaning of the scriptures from. And so when we remember this, maybe that means that we shouldn't look to contemporary examples to fulfill those specific prophecies. Instead, we might actually do a good job if we just stay in the passage and the historical context surrounding it. And when we do that, well, let's just look at Revelation 13 real quick. A couple verses here. Let's talk about the beast for a moment. The beast was given a mouth to utter boasts and blasphemies. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months, and it was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them. It was also given authority over every tribe, people, and language and nation. All those who live on the earth will worship it, and this calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, and every internet troll just went nuts. Because it is the number of a person. It is the number 666. And then you go down to Revelation 17. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain for only a little while. Now, I've taken some verses out of chapter 13 and 17. These are some of the key passages that talk about the beast, his influence, his power, if you will, his activity, all these sorts of things. But I want us to remember again that there are first century Christians who are reading this for the first time, which means they had some first century reference points by which to know and understand what in the world John was talking about. And so let me share some interesting historical facts with you. The first of all is this. How many of you have ever heard the phrase, hey, I'm going to, or I'm from the tall city? Anybody know what the tall city is? What's a tall city? It's Midland. What about this? Hey, yeah, I was in Cowtown this weekend. Fort Worth, exactly. You know, the ancient world wasn't too unlike ours. They had nicknames for their towns. And in the ancient world, the city on 7 hills was a common nickname for the city of Rome. The city on 7 hills was a common nickname for the city of Rome. And interestingly enough, there was this one in particular emperor of Rome by the name of Nero, who was the 6th king after Julius Caesar. Remember, Revelation 17:10 said, 5 kings have fallen, one is, and there is one to come. Nero was the 6th king after Julius Caesar. Not only that, but the emperor after Nero, a guy by the name of Galba, only reigned for 7 months. Remember, Revelation 17 says that he'll only reign for a little while. Not only that, Nero was literally called the Beast in the first century. He was literally called that. That was a nickname for him. You know why? Because he would actually have people strung up, and then he would put on animal skin and eat their flesh. He was a sick, twisted man. The name Roman candle, you know where we get that name from? Nero. Because Roman candles were Christians who were used to light up the city of Rome at night, covered in oil and burned alive. Nero was a beast of a man. He was probably schizophrenic. I mean, all sorts of things. You read the historical record on this guy. You can Google this, by the way. He was an absolutely atrocious man who literally and figuratively personified a beast in his activity and his actions toward other people. And he was the most vicious persecutor of Christians in the first century. As a matter of fact, he persecuted Christians for exactly 42 months, which is exactly what Revelation 13 says the beast is going to do in verses 5 and 7. Not only that, Nero was worshipped as divine. He was worshipped as divine, which was not an uncommon practice, by the way, for Roman emperors. Now here's what's really interesting. The number 666. See, the ancient languages like Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, they always would assign a numerical value to a person's name. And in the ancient Hebrew, whenever you look at the numerical value of Neron Kaiser or Nero Caesar, you know what it comes out to? 666. 666 equals Nero Caesar in Hebrew cryptogram. Now, what does that mean? Who is the beast? My current conclusion. You ready for it? I got no idea. But they, that is the first century Christians, they probably had a better idea than we do. Because John was giving them first century reference points to answer that very question. And he was giving them the cultural context that they would have known. If a first century Christian got a letter from the tall city about going to Cowtown, they'd be like, what in the world is this guy talking about? But if a first century Christian got a letter about something happening from the city on the 7 hills with this guy that's a beast who's going to persecute Christians for 42 months, then maybe, just maybe, those first century Christians actually had the reference points to know what he was talking about. But here's why I show this to you, okay? I show this to you because even as compelling as that historical case may be, I don't know. I'm not as convinced as I'd like to be because I don't know if God has given us all the information we need to answer that question. And so, here's what I would say to you. If your argument for whoever the beast is does not have at least this much evidence, then you're probably wrong. Can I just be that honest with you? Like, if you think that it's the next new thing that Bill Gates comes out with, I'm sorry, you're probably wrong. It just doesn't have that much evidence aside from fear and suspicion around the government, which means, in other words, please stop worrying about the COVID-19 vaccine. Can you do that? Like, you can worry about it for other reasons. Like, if you have legitimate health concerns, if you have legitimate issues with, like, the healthcare side of things, I'm great with that. Like, you do your thing. But can we please stop calling it the mark of the beast when there's not any more evidence besides your fear that is driving it? Can we do that? Are you guys mad at me yet? You're like, you're the beast, Josh. Come on. All right, well, let's get back to what Jesus said. That's a good idea when I make somebody mad. And so, let's come back to Jesus answering the disciples' first question. Remember, he's still talking to them about these beginning of labor pains. The first sign is that there's going to be false prophets and teachers. The second sign is military and political conflict. We are on page 8, by the way. Military and political conflict. You know the passage. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, so on and so forth. Now, you need to know this was actually an unusual claim at the time. It wouldn't be uncommon for us to hear about wars and rumors of wars now. We hear about them all the time. But in the first century, there was something called the Pax Romana that was going on, the Peace of Rome, in which there were some occasional skirmishes, but there weren't major cataclysmic events. Rome's army was not marching significantly. This is around the 30s or so, whenever Jesus is saying this. There was widespread, for the most part, peace. So when Jesus is talking about wars and rumors of wars, this is striking the first audience, the disciples, at a time in which this just was not happening very much. But interestingly enough, not long actually, after Jesus dies, you see about 20,000 people, Jewish people, killed in an uprising in Caesarea, 50,000 people killed in Alexandria, 10,000 killed in Damascus. You also hear about wars in Germany, Africa, Armenia, and Britain between 14 and 68 AD. So all within a short period of time, you have this massive influx of people dying. Now remember, 20,000 people in the first century is kind of like 2 million people in the 21st century. It's a lot more people back then because the cities were smaller, populations were less dense, people walked everywhere, the villages were not as established as cities are today. And so whenever Jesus makes this claim when there's not a whole lot happening, and then within about 30 or 40 years or so, people are dying like crazy, imagine you're a first century disciple. Wouldn't you begin to think back to what Jesus is saying about wars and rumors of wars? Well, what does Jesus say is sign number 3? He says that there's going to be famines and earthquakes. Famines and earthquakes. As far as famines go, we know in the book of Acts, chapter 11, that there would be a severe famine throughout the Roman world that would take place during the reign of Claudius, which was in 44 AD, and this actually did happen. And then there were 3 other famines during the New Testament period. Some were in the reign of Claudius, and then there was a major famine in Rome in 51 AD. Well, then there was also earthquakes. There are actually 4 recorded earthquakes in the New Testament. Interestingly enough, all of them happen Jesus' crucifixion and then after. You have Jesus' crucifixion, you have his resurrection, then you have the upper room prayer meeting in Acts chapter 2, and then you have Paul and Silas being released from prison in Acts chapter 16. Not only that, but at this time, there was not, again, widespread quake activity happening in the ancient world in the first century that we know of. And yet, within the first century, you've got cities of Laodicea, Hierapolis, and Colossae being devastated by an earthquake in the year 60. Again, you're a first century Christian. You're seeing these things happen, and you've been given this authoritative teaching from Jesus. What might you begin thinking? Well, what about sign number 4 and 5? Oh, by the way, this probably means that COVID-19 is probably not one of the famines Jesus refers to, by the way. What about number 4? Jesus says that there's going to be persecution, and then the 5th sign he gives them is apostasy, or widespread falling away. Sign number 4 and 5 are persecution and apostasy. Now, I want you to notice, I'm showing you the Mark parallel to what we read in Matthew 24. But I want you to notice how Mark describes this very same circumstance. He says, but you, be on your guard. He's recording Jesus' words. They will hand you over to local courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues. Anybody been beaten up in a synagogue lately? Anybody worried about being beaten up in a synagogue? No. You see, again, the first century Jewish orientation around what's happening here. This is the exact same verse in Mark's account that we just read in Matthew when Jesus says you're going to be handed over and flogged and so forth. You see, again, the first century context here. Not only that, but I'm going to show you one of those passages in 1 John that talks about this. Notice how John uses the phrase Antichrist here. Children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. By this we know that it is the last hour. And then he says this, they went out from us, apostasy, but they did not belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. However, they went out so that it might be made clear that none of them actually belongs to us. And if you read the New Testament over and over and over again, what are the first century writers always warning against? Don't fall away. Don't fall away. There's going to be those who fall away. Don't follow them. There's going to be those who deny the faith. Don't deny the faith with them. What do you also see in the New Testament over and over again? You're going to be persecuted. You're going to suffer. You're going to go through trials. You're going to go through tribulations. Do not be surprised when the fiery trials come upon you. Again, if you're a first century Christian receiving these letters, going through these experiences, and you have the authoritative teaching of Jesus in your near recent memory, what might you be thinking? And then finally, turn the page over to page 9. The final sign that Jesus gives his disciples about when these things will take place is the worldwide proclamation of the gospel. Jesus says this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And I know some of you are like, see, none of this could have been fulfilled in the first century because not all the nations know about Christ yet. And if Jesus is going to come back when all the nations know about Christ, then we got to get to going, right? Well, yes, we need to get to going. Like, we still need to get the gospel out to the nations. But what if Jesus was not talking about the entire world as we understand it today in the 21st century? In fact, when you read some of the documents in the New Testament, that seems to be how the apostles themselves understood Jesus' words. What does the apostle Paul say in Colossians chapter 1, verse 5? He says this, you have already heard about this hope in the word of the truth, the gospel that has come to you. It is bearing fruit and growing all over the world. Was the gospel in Texas by then? Was the gospel in South America by then? No, Paul says it's growing all over the world, and yet we know there are parts of the world the gospel was not in yet. In fact, Paul goes on to say, this gospel has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven. Was Paul lying? Is there an error in the Bible? Did we just make the skeptics' case for them? No. You see, the New Testament writers use this phrase to mean the known world at the time. The known world at the time. And the known world to them was the Eastern world, not the Western world. And so when Jesus makes this claim about the gospel going into all the world, what is he saying? It's going to go into all the known world. And interestingly enough, Paul says by about 60 AD in Colossians, hey, that's happening right here, right now. It's being fulfilled. And so this means, by the way, remember, the end does not mean the end of the world, but the end of the age. So what are some conclusions that we can draw from this first section of Matthew 24? Well, we got to remember that none of these were the signs of the end. They were the beginning of labor pains. How many people, women in here, have given birth before? Sometimes your labor pains last a while, don't they? Yeah, our son waited about 17 hours, and that was a long time. What do the labor pains mean? It means something's coming, but it's not here just yet. Why is that important for us to know? It means that when the disciples see those signs, that is not evidence that the end is coming. That's just evidence that things are about to get bad and that the end is on its way. It doesn't mean it's right around the corner, but that we're nearing the end is what they would have understood. But if you'll notice, in each one of these signs, each of these events had first century fulfillments. Each one of these had first century fulfillments. And look, we don't have to look too far outside of the Bible and some surrounding historical context and a good commentary to get that information. That's all we have to do. Each of these events had first century fulfillments, which means, you ready for it? Big point that I thought a lot about. You ready? Means we should probably stop reading American news into biblical prophecy. Somebody give me an amen. Can I just... I appreciate y'all. I thought y'all were really mad at me earlier about the other thing, so I appreciate this. And then finally, what we witness today probably has more to do with a broken world than with the end of the world. A broken world versus the end of the world. All right, so I'm going to put the truck in park for a little bit. I'm going to give you all about 5 minutes to just kind of debrief, digest, go to the bathroom, and then we're going to come back. But let's have a little bit of debrief time. What is one thing that really stood out to you in this segment? What is one thing you disagree with or find yourself questioning? And is your brain about to explode yet? Wherever you find yourself, take 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll get going and we'll finish up our time. All right. Let's come back together. All right. Okay. How's everybody doing? Doing good? You mentally exhausted yet, or you got another round in you? You good? All right. I don't think the next round is going to be as much information to process, but we are going to talk about the rapture, so that should be fun. And yeah. So anyway, all right. Well, again, I'm trying real hard to get you out of here at 8:30, and so we gotta keep going. One thing I do want to let you know about is this whole evening is being recorded, and so anything you say can and will. I'm just kidding. No, really, we're recording the whole video and audio. In fact, many of the folks are live streaming with us right now. By the way, thank y'all so much for tuning in with us. But if you want to go back and watch this, if you want to take additional notes, or if you find yourself even like Janice was just telling me, like, I'm not going to take notes tonight, I'm just going to listen and absorb and go back later. Hey, this will be on the website on our resource page in the coming weeks. I will save all your information in the registration link, and I will send out a link for you guys when it is on our website. So you can go back over it, and you can listen to it. Plus, you got the resources on the back of the page, too. But just know, whatever you don't catch tonight, or if you want to have conversation afterward, then we're going to have this resource available to you on the website in the coming weeks or so. Sound good? All right. Well, here's the deal. We've only answered question number 1. Remember, the disciples asked Jesus 2 questions, and so let's jump into question number 2. Now, we got some context. Again, we're just reminding each other a little bit. Remember, the disciples asked Jesus, what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So the first question was, when will these things be? And in verses 4 through 14, Jesus gives them about 6 signs, and he says, but these are just the beginning of labor pains. They're not the sign of the end. They're the sign that the end is down the road and something starting that's about to bring it to pass. Now we have second question, which is, what is the sign? Like, what is the sign that we're going to know? A few things to observe. The disciples want to know when the end is coming. What's the end? Remember, the end of the age does not mean the end of the world. Remember, when they're asking that question, they're not asking about the end of the space-time universe. They're asking about the end of the Jewish age, the end of the Old Covenant age, the end of the age before the Messiah is fully reigning on his throne. The end of the age means the end of the Jewish age. And Jesus, I believe, provides the answer to this question in Matthew 24, verses 15 and following, pretty much in verses 15 through 35. And he does this by talking about what's called the Great Tribulation. And so remember earlier we talked about the Great Tribulation as one of the big key reference points on kind of your end times map. This is the main passage from which we get our understanding of the Great Tribulation, whether it is a future event or a past event. So let's jump back in. In verse 15, Jesus says this, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Now, if that's not a cryptic Bible verse, I don't know what is, right? You read that and you're like, what in the world is Jesus talking about? Well, let's ask some questions. Remember, the Bible was not written to us. It was written for us. There is an original audience. There is a first century context. And so if we can answer the question, how did the original audience understand the abomination of desolation? Then we're going to be far along at understanding what the original meaning of this passage was. Make sense? Okay, so let's ask a few questions. Who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to his disciples. When you see, who's the you? The disciples. How will the disciples experience the abomination of desolation? They will what? They will see it. And that could mean, by the way, they will see it with their physical eyes, or they will know about it happening and they will understand it. They will see it spiritually. One way or the other, it's the disciples who are going to have some sort of cognitive apprehension or understanding of this event. Number 3, where will this abomination of desolation be? It'll be in the holy place, which is another name for the temple. It'll be in the Jewish temple, the holy place. So, number 4, what is the abomination of desolation? Well, let's ask that question first by looking at the Old Testament. What was the abomination of desolation. You see, this wasn't the first time Jesus was referring, or rather, this phrase, the abomination of desolation, was not the first time that first century Jewish people would have heard about this. No, in fact, when you read the book of Daniel, there's about 4 key verses that speak about an abominable thing that took place. And every single one of these references, when you look these up, and you can look these up and read the whole context surrounding them, every single reference refers to the desecration of the temple, of the first temple, of King Solomon's temple. In other words, first century Jews had an understanding of an abominable thing that took place in the first temple. Not only that, Jesus' followers were aware of a specific event that took place in 168 BC. Now, this refers to when the Syrian king Antiochus slaughtered about 40,000 Jews, plundered the temple, and then he sacrificed a pig on the altar. Now, if you know anything about Jewish dietary, kosher, and cleanliness laws, sacrificing a pig on the altar of a Jewish temple is about like sacrificing a Texas Longhorn on Texas Tech Stadium. Like, it's a big deal. Like, it was an absolutely atrocious thing and an offensive thing for a Jew to experience. Not only that, but this king set up an image of Zeus above the altar to be worshipped. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, Josh, I thought the temple, the first one, was destroyed a couple hundred years before that. That's correct. Before the Herodian temple was built, there was an intermediate temple that was actually built, and this is the one that Antiochus comes into to plunder. And you can see one of the footnotes that I've got in there for your notes gives more detail there. But the point is that there was this event that took place in the temple in which it was an abomination of desolation. In fact, that phrase, abomination of desolation, the reason why Jesus says, let the reader understand, is because the reader, the student, the Jewish disciple of Jewish history would have read about this event. It would have been a part of their cultural heritage. It would have been a part of their cultural history. Why? Because at this time, that phrase, abomination of desolation, referred specifically to this event in 168 AD. So, when Jesus uses this phrase, when he's talking about the abomination of desolation, what is he referring to? More than likely, he's referring to a repeat scenario of what happened in 168, which means that he's referring to something that has something to do with the temple and with pagan worship. With temple and pagan worship. Now again, Luke 21 is the parallel account. Remember, you got Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. In Luke 21, whenever you read this exact same verse, it does not say abomination of desolation. No, it says this: when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that its desolation has come near. Why would Luke change it? Because Luke is writing to a primarily Gentile audience who would not have had that Jewish history to refer back to. Now, there were definitely Jews in the congregation for Luke, but he, as a Gentile, is writing to a more mixed audience than Matthew. Matthew says abomination of desolation. Luke says surrounded by armies, recognize that its desolation has come near. And so, what's interesting is that when you move out into the first century a little bit and you get closer and closer to 70 AD, here's what you find. You find that the Roman army under General Titus began a 5-month siege on the city of Jerusalem in 69 AD. Remember, Syrian king, armies, Antiochus, that was the first time. This time, what's happening is Roman armies, Roman general, and you've got this guy coming at 69 AD surrounding the temple. And note Jesus' instructions in 16 through 20. He says, run away. Get out of town. Don't stay around for this. Why? Because 70 AD was one of the most horrific events, honestly, in the historical record across the entire scope of world history, even today, but also especially in the first century. Jesus says this: for at that time there will be great distress. Whatever he's talking about with reference to the tribulation, he says there will be great distress, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will be again. Well, if you know anything about military history, then you know that whenever an opposing army lays siege to a camp or a fort or a village, it is an absolute worst case scenario. What does a siege do? A siege locks you inside of your home. It cuts off your supply lines. It cuts off all your clean water. It cuts off all your power supply. It cuts off all your food. It's kind of like last week in Midland, actually. We were all under siege last week. We kind of know what's going on here. But you got to imagine the whole city of Jerusalem going under siege. What begins to happen is there's mass starvation, disease, dehydration, cannibalism, and more. People sold their homes and their children to obtain food. Let me repeat that again. People sold their homes and their children to obtain food. Not only that, people regularly ate from public sewers. They had no food, no clean water. Thousands were crucified, around 500 a day, by the Romans when they tried to go look for food outside of the city walls. Imagine the scene. Imagine the scene. Wooden crosses going up at numbers of 500 a day with your countrymen, with your kinsmen, and they are being slaughtered. And then inside, it's not any better at all. As a matter of fact, we know from the historical record that around 1.1 million were killed and around 100,000 survivors were sold into slavery. This is about the entire population in Jerusalem at this time. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was there for the event, he was actually acting as an emissary for General Titus, ironically, says this: "For the ground did nowhere appear visible because of the dead bodies that lay upon it. The upper rooms were filled with women and children dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, all swelled with the famine, and fell down dead wheresoever their misery seized them. Thus the miseries of Jerusalem grew worse and worse every day." This was the worst experience of destruction that they had seen in their history. And they had seen a lot. Read the Old Testament, lots of judgment, lots of destruction, and yet Josephus is telling us this thing is worse. Read that first sentence again. "For the ground did nowhere appear visible because of the dead bodies that lay upon it." I've given you some more quotations there from him so you can see even more how it grew worse and worse every day. But Sam Storms, in his book, Kingdom Come, says this: "While the city was still burning, the soldiers brought their legionary standards, which were the images of Caesar and the Roman eagle, into the temple precincts, and they offered sacrifices to their gods, declaring Titus to be the victor. The idolatrous representations of Caesar and the Roman eagle on the standards would have constituted the worst imaginable blasphemy to the Jewish people. The first time it was Antiochus, it was a pig, and it was an altar of Zeus. This time it's General Titus, it's the Roman eagle, and it's other sacrifices to their gods." Now Jesus warns of false teaching rising up, and false teachers, rather, rising up to offer false hope of salvation. He kind of repeats this whole warning again, and he says, hey, if somebody comes and says the Messiah is here or salvation's coming, he's like, don't believe them. This is actually false hope. And he says to them, "For as lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." Now that phrase, the Son of Man, is one of Jesus' favorite nicknames. But the coming of the Son of Man has been misinterpreted a lot because a lot of times we don't understand how a first century Jew would have understood that. First of all, this coming of the Son of Man is not him coming to save. He says explicitly, if someone tells you the Messiah is here or he's coming, don't believe them. He's telling them very clearly this is not a salvation coming, but it's his coming to judge the nation of Israel through the army of Rome. Again, Matthew 23, he's just given a ton of judgment language on the nation of Israel. And then in chapter 24, he talks about the destruction of their house. Your house will be laid to you desolate. So when Jesus says this coming of the Son of Man, he's not talking about salvation here. He's talking about judgment. And what was the national, by the way, verse 28 is kind of funny because Jesus says, where the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. You know, one way you can translate vultures is eagles. What was the national bird of Rome? It was the eagle. And so when Jesus is talking about this, he's actually giving, again, some more historical context, some context clues about what this is going to look like for a first century audience. We're now on page 12. But then there's those few verses 29 through 31, that are just so dadgum cryptic and have gotten so many interpretations around them that all talk about this other coming of the Son of Man. So the first question we got to ask here is this: is Jesus talking about astronomical signs? Whenever he says the sun will be darkened and the moon turned to blood, right? If you've seen the book or any of the stuff around blood moons or anything like that, a lot of that interpretation is based on this. Is Jesus talking about astronomical signs? The answer is no, he's not. Jesus is using Old Testament judgment language to describe the change of kingdoms, or a kingdom change. I think I've already given you that one in your notes. In other words, when you look at the Old Testament, every time there is a major judgment and a changing of kingdoms, whether it's with Israel or Babylon or Egypt or Edom, this exact same language is used. In other words, what happens a lot of times is the Old Testament will use heavenly language to describe the destruction of earthly kingdoms. They'll talk about things in the heavens that represent things on earth. And you know what? We do the same thing. You ever said before, the sky is falling? I'll never forget, a couple months ago, I walked outside and I said, it's raining cats and dogs. And my son looked up and said, where? Cats? Dogs? No, son, it's a metaphor. He's like, a what? 6-year-olds don't understand that. We've done this all the time with our own language. And the Old Testament's no different. They used heavenly language to describe the changing of earthly kingdoms or earthly realities. Second question is this: is the Son of Man coming down, or is he coming up? This is huge. Is he coming down or is he coming up? Well, in Daniel chapter 7, this is the key text at which Jesus is drawing upon whenever he speaks about himself as the Son of Man. And this is one of the key interpretive passages for a lot of what Jesus means when he uses the phrase Son of Man. Let's read it. I continued, this is Daniel, Old Testament, looking into the future. I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days. Who's the Ancient of Days? God. Exactly. And was escorted before him. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language would serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting kingdom that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. When Jesus is talking about you will see the coming of the Son of Man, he's not talking about coming down to like physically save. He's talking about you're going to see through the destruction of the Jerusalem temple that now the Son of Man is coming up to receive his kingdom, dominion, and authority. Remember, the temple was the centerpiece of their spiritual and political hope. And now Jesus, in saying that you're going to see the coming of the Son of Man, and it's going to be this violent, really shattering or shaking up of earthly systems, he is using Old Testament imagery that they would have understood to describe the changing of a kingdom. For the Jewish people, their lives were centered around the temple. And now Jesus is saying it's not going to be centered around the temple anymore. It's going to be centered around something else. There's a new kingdom. There's a new regime. There's a new temple of all sorts. So question number 3 then, what is the sign that the people are going to see? What is the sign of the Son of Man coming? The destruction of the temple. It's the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple. You're looking up and you see it burning. It's the sign in the sky that things are changing permanently. In other words, these verses use Old Testament symbols to describe the enthronement, the spiritual enthronement of Jesus over the nation of Israel and the end of the Jewish age. Remember, the Jewish people wanted a king to sit on David's throne. Jesus is the king, and he is on the throne. But that throne is going to no longer be in the physical temple because there's a new temple. Church, who's the temple? We are. We are. We're the temple of God. And all of this was the transition point at which they understood this to be happening. Again, Sam Storms is helpful here. When the temple in Jerusalem was raised, leveled, and flattened, such that not one stone was left upon another, the people of that day saw that everything the temple symbolized and achieved is now found in King Jesus, who rules over the universe. There has been a regime change. The temple is dethroned, and Jesus is enthroned. Final question. What's verse 31 all about? Who are these angels? Who are these messengers that are going to go around doing something for Jesus? Well, this is a reference to the preaching of the gospel throughout the world. Remember, Jesus says, and then my messengers are going to go out into the four winds of the earth and gather my elect or my chosen or the people that are going to believe in me. And this is a reference to the preaching of the gospel throughout the world. But remember, what's the world at this time? Physically, it's still the whole thing, but they didn't know about the Western world. It was the known world, the Mediterranean world, the Eastern world, which means that this is a reference either to human messengers like Paul and Peter and those guys, or it was spiritual beings. It could have been an actual reference to angels who would empower the preaching and the proclamation of the gospel. Either way, it doesn't matter how you answer that question, just read the book of Acts. What happens in the book of Acts? They go to the nations. They go to Ephesus. They go to Samaria. They go to all these different, you go to Acts chapter 8, and it goes to the Ethiopian eunuch. It goes to the nations. And so, what is the Great Tribulation? Page 13. What is the Great Tribulation that Jesus was referring to in Matthew 24? You ready? Are you ready? All right, maybe a better question is, what was the Great Tribulation? What was the Great Tribulation? Because I think everything that we just looked at here, my opinion, although some would disagree, is that the Great Tribulation was the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. It was the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. First century audience, first century symbols, first century fulfillment, first century language, first century activity, and this major cataclysmic event in the first century that had massive spiritual and political ramifications and implications for that generation, I think is a good candidate for the Great Tribulation. Now, it's interesting because when Jesus finishes this section, notice what he says. He says, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. So when Jesus gets done telling them about all these bad things, he finishes by saying, this generation. And then he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. In other words, Jesus makes it clear. The Great Tribulation, I think, is a past and not a future event. And it symbolizes the end of the Jewish age. Jesus, in other words, is talking specifically to that generation that heard him speak. You can look throughout the Gospels, and every time the phrase, this generation is used, it is always used as a reference to the contemporary audience of Jesus. Not only that, but interestingly enough, heaven and earth, that phrase, was a nickname for the temple. It was where heaven and earth met. It was the place where God dwelt among his people. Jesus directly says, heaven and earth will pass away. The temple will pass away. But my words, my authority, my kingship will never pass away. Now, I've got something on there I think right on the last part of your notes. I went ahead and marked that out because I think I just had a brain goof today, and so you can just ignore that last point. I marked that one out for you, and so don't worry about that one. Go ahead and turn over to page 14, because now when we get to the rest of Matthew 24, this is where most people think that Jesus is talking about his second coming and the rapture. And to be quite honest with you, you've got two options here. In the rest of Matthew 24, either Jesus is talking about the same event, i.e. he's continuing his same discourse about the temple destruction in 70 AD, or he's referring to a different event, namely his second coming. And honestly, I could see good arguments to go either way for that one. That one is completely up to you. We're not going to spend any time talking about that one because I think that one is a good thing for you to do some homework on. But let's have some fun here with this question. What about the rapture? Has anybody ever had an experience with the rapture? And by that, I mean you were told about the rapture, taught about the rapture, and then one day you woke up and your parents were at the grocery store and they did not tell you they were leaving. Anybody have this experience? Yeah. As Larry said in one of our meetings the other day, if the rapture starts happening tomorrow, we better start grabbing ankles or something. Because whatever you believe about the rapture, it could happen at any moment in time, and you never know if you're going to be a part of that group, right? I mean, it's just one of those weird things. Left Behind series, the books, the movies, Kirk Cameron, whole 9 yards. The rapture. It's a big deal. Interestingly enough, though, the rapture is actually the most recent theological position in the entire history of the church. It's the most recent position that anybody has articulated. As a matter of fact, The rapture doctrine was first taught, you ready for this? In the 1830s. Nobody that we know of believed or taught the rapture prior to 1830. And it was by a guy named John Nelson Darby. Actually, he got it from somebody else, but there's a longer story there. And I've given you that in your notes. So, just because something is late does not mean it's not true, okay? But I just want you to hear me out. This means that the first disciples in church history that we know of Paul, Peter, John, and every other church father, did not write about the rapture. And they wrote about a lot of things. In fact, we can reconstruct the entire New Testament with the early church fathers' quotations and letters to each other. They wrote that much, and they never talked about a rapture. Not once. They never interpreted Matthew 24 or 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 or 5. None of them interpreted any of those things to refer to a rapture. Nobody did, as a matter of fact, until around the 1830s. Again, that does not mean that it's not true. This guy could have had a unique insight that none of those guys did, but it's unlikely. When you've got the disciples of the disciples of the disciples all throughout church history, and no one ever hears about or knows about this until the 1830s. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying it's not a strong case, historically speaking. Now, when you keep going from this, you may think, well, but Jesus talks explicitly about the days of Noah, and he makes a reference here, right? And what does he say whenever he talks about this? He talks about some will be left behind, and some are going to be brought up. Like there's going to be this, some are in the field, some are doing their thing, and some are going to be left behind. Well, remember the story of Noah? Anybody remember that story? Not the movie version. I mean, that was weird. But the actual story of Noah. Question, who was actually left behind on the earth in the days of Noah? Was it the wicked people or the righteous people? Who was saved in Noah's flood? It was Noah and his family. It was the righteous people. What does the rapture doctrine teach? That the righteous are taken up and the wicked are left behind. But in the days of Noah, it's the exact opposite. The righteous are left behind and the wicked are the ones who leave the earth. And so what's interesting is I think that when you look at the actual story, it's the righteous who are left behind, not the wicked. But I think Jesus is once again not talking here about a secret rapture, but about a visible judgment. He's using, once again, language of destruction, using language of calamity, using language of be on guard, be ready. These things are bad. Why? Why would the first century audience need to know that? Because something was going to happen in their lifetime that was going to be a cataclysmic judgment level event. Now here's the most controversial thing you might hear me say all night. My opinion. I do not believe the New Testament teaches a rapture of believers. A secret rapture, I do not think is what the New Testament teaches. Others will disagree with me. Most of them are at that table right there, the elders right there. See them? Right there. They're disagreeing with me with their eyes. I'm looking over here now. No, seriously. And here's the thing. If you disagree, here's the cool thing about these secondary things. They're not faith-dividing issues. And they're not the sort of things that we throw bombs at each other on social media about or anything like that. This is one of those things that we look at and go, okay, Josh, you say no rapture. I say yes rapture. Let's have a conversation. Let's reason it out. Let's look at the biblical text. Let's go through these sorts of things, and let's actually compare passage for passage, interpretation for interpretation, and let's just see what makes the most sense. That's how you do these things in the church, because this is not an issue to divide over, but here's the deal. If you come to the same conclusion that I come to, one thing that I can tell you personally is that I don't worry about that secret rapture happening and me getting left behind. You know what I'm looking forward to? The second coming of Jesus whenever he makes all things new. And so, for me personally, I just don't worry about that. Now again, don't believe there's not a rapture just because I said that or because you don't want those feelings. Work through these passages for yourself and come to that conclusion on your own. But when you get to the end of the passage, what I find is really interesting is what Jesus actually tells us the last days are going to be like. Jesus says there's going to be widespread, ready for it? Normalcy. Because he references again the days of Noah. What was happening? There was eating and drinking and marrying. It's going to be pretty normal. In fact, the Apostle Paul, I'm going to bring in one passage from 1 Thessalonians, says it's going to be a strong sense of peace and safety. Paul says this, when they say peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon you like labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Interesting. Paul says that the last days are going to be characterized by peace and security, and then sudden destruction is going to come. Jesus says normalcy. Paul says peace and security. Now remember what I told you before. Don't read a Bible verse. Go read that whole context of 1 Thessalonians 5 and see if I'm misinterpreting it. It'd be great. But finally, Jesus says it's going to be a total surprise, like a thief in the night. Question, have you ever had a thief call to tell you when he's coming to break into your house? You have not. Has he ever given you any indication, hey, I'm going to come on this day? Hey, here's going to be some indications. I'm going to leave this over here on the right side of your house, and that's letting you know that on Monday after next, I'm going to be coming over to steal your stuff. No, a thief does not give you clues and indications when he's coming, and that's what Jesus is saying. It's going to be like a thief in the night. It will be a total surprise. And so, what does Jesus expect of us in the meantime? Page 16. Jesus tells us this. Blessed is that servant whom the master finds doing his job when he comes. What's our job? Well, I showed you a bunch of images earlier that were part of our recent memory. I want to show you another image that was a part of another group of Christians' recent memory about 50, 60, and 70 years ago. What comes to your mind whenever you see this? The atomic bomb changed the landscape of military warfare, but it also created in the minds and the hearts of many people a deep fear and a deep apprehension. Is this going to be the day? Will we lose everything? Is our city going to get bombed today? Are we going to lose all of civilization? Nuclear proliferation in the 20th century was one of the greatest causes in many ways for some of the end times teaching that got so popular about, well, you better get saved or you're going to get left behind or whatever the case may be. And yet, what's interesting is that Christians had to deal with those sorts of issues as well. And they had to find a way, based on good theology and a good interpretation of their Bibles, to actually maintain hope, to maintain confidence, to maintain faithfulness, and to maintain a consistent witness, even in an atomic age. And this didn't just go away after a couple of years. This is something that from the time it came into existence all the way through the Cold War, especially in the Cold War, and even today, is a lingering concern. And yet, one of the men that I cannot wait to meet when I get to heaven, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, writing to the people of England in 1947, said this. In one way, we think a great too much of the atomic bomb. How are we to live in an atomic age? I am tempted to reply, why? You should live as you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year. Or as you would have lived in the Viking age when the raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Do not let us begin by exaggerating how new these fears and concerns are. It is perfectly ridiculous to go about whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of a painful and premature death, in which death itself it was not a chance at all, but rather a certainty of life. The first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we're going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, then let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friend over a pint and a game of darts. Not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies, but a microbe can do that. But they need not dominate our minds. That's what it means to be faithful, to be doing our job until Jesus comes back. And so, if I could give you some concluding exhortations, and then we'll answer our question for this evening with 7 minutes left. Yes! Here's what I would tell you to leave today considering. Let's stop speculating and spectating, and let's get in the game. Here's what I mean. Can we please quit spending so much time doing so many other things besides investing into people? can we stop doing so many things besides investing into our family and our kids and our coworkers and our relationships that actually matter and mean the most? All the time that we spend circulating the latest conspiracy theory does not do anything good for us. It definitely harms our witness, but it does not advance the kingdom of Jesus because it doesn't involve people who we have been called to serve and connect with based on how God has designed, called, and gifted us. Speculation and spectating are not doing our job. But secondly, please, for the love of Jesus, his people, and those you influence, stop believing every new conspiracy theory that hits social media. Please. I love you, but it is hurting our witness when we do this. You know that what happens is every time there's another conspiracy theory, the reason I showed you the history of interpretation on that was so you know we're not the first ones to think the next new thing in our age is the thing that's going to end the world. And you know what the lost world looks at? They go, oh, another bunch of Christians with their latest end of the world scenario. What if we stopped proliferating end times conspiracies and we started proliferating the good news of the gospel? What if we started spending more time getting to know people, spending life with people, coaching soccer, being invested in people's lives, and actually doing the things that matter? And you know what? Maybe that happens on social media, and maybe it leads to other things. But the point is, let's stop buying into every new thing the enemy injects into our society to get us distracted and dismayed and discouraged. In other words, let's stop living like the sky is falling, and let's start living like Jesus is king. Let's stop living like the sky is falling, and let's start living like Jesus is king. Because that is why, thank you, Janice. I was hoping I'd save that for the end, but we're getting there. That's why one of our favorite verses here at Stonegate, go therefore and make disciples. You got to read the verse before. Jesus came near to his disciples and said to them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age. The reason we go and make disciples is because Jesus is king, and we have nothing to fear when Jesus is king. So let's answer our question. Are we living in the last days? This is not something you have on your notes. I added it later. I'm sorry. Are we living in the last days? My answer, whose answer? Mine. My answer is yes and no. Yes, we are living in the age to come that the Jewish people were looking forward to. We are living in the Messianic age, the New Covenant age, the final age before the final age, if you will. There is still for us an age to come, which is the new heaven and the new earth, the second coming of Christ when Jesus comes back to make all things new. But we are living in the age to come that first century Jewish followers were looking forward to and that Jesus inaugurated in his first coming. So yes, but no. No, we are probably not living in the final moments of history leading up to Christ's second coming. The things that we see in our world today are probably more endemic of a broken world than the end of the world. But Jesus could come back any day and surprise us. But just remember, it will be a surprise, like a thief in the night, not an expectation. And so whatever crazy stuff you look at as evidence for the end times today, it's probably not evidence for the end times today. You know what it is evidence of? The brokenness of a world that needs the hope of a Savior named Jesus. And who's going to carry that message to them? We are. So until then, let's focus less on what we don't know and more on what we do know, because the truth is Jesus is advancing his kingdom. He is marching forward. The real question is, will we join him or will we not? Now you can clap. All right. Wait, let me do this. Let me pray for us real quick, and then I'm going to let you go. If you want to stay back and chat for a little bit, please feel free. If not, you can connect with me via email. Call me at the office here in this week. By the way, my email address is larrygilbert@stonegatefellowship.com. Let's pray. Father, thanks so much for tonight. Thanks for these people. Thanks for your people. God, help us to be a people who understand your word. And if there are those who are leaving tonight, God, who are questioning, who are thinking, who are challenging what we talked about tonight, that is 100% okay. I pray they would dig into your word. I pray they would study your word. I pray they would get into the details and come to their own convictions and conclusions. But wherever we land, God, may we not be a people of fear. May we be a people of faith. And may we not live like the sky is falling. May we live believing that you are King, and may we live our lives for that truth, and may we give our lives for that kingdom. We ask it in your name. Amen. All right, go get your kiddos. Have a good night.